In 2018, Charles Upton published the monumental Dugin against Dugin, a traditionalist critique of the fourth political theory. That this work merits inclusion in the body of works I have termed perennialist political pre-theory goes without saying. A reading of it, in its 530-page entirety, is obviously out of the question. I considered providing a reading of selected passages, but Upton's style makes selecting those passages challenging. For these reasons, as well as the book's fairly recent publication date, I have opted instead to provide a review of the work. This is a work that richly deserves to be read. It is an important critique of Dugin, indubitably the chief purveyor of an inverted perversion of the traditionalist school at large in the world today. This is in no small measure due to the presentation of Dugin as a preeminent representative of traditionalism by the likes of Mark Sedgwick and Benjamin Teitelbaum. Indeed, the cover of Teitelbaum's book on the topic features Dugin's visage as prominently as it does Genon's, and does not depict Shuon or Coomaraswamy at all. A refutation of Dugin as being an authentic traditionalist was something long overdue. The first thing to be said about this work, already alluded to, is that it is presented in Mr. Upton's signature style. Said style entails a conversational approach characterized by much context being supplied for every point, as well as many deeply interesting and informative digressions. This approach makes for very rich works, but it does not produce concise or focused books. For my part, I very much enjoy Upton's style, but I must acknowledge it is not for everyone. In any case, this wide-ranging style makes Dugin against Dugin exceptionally difficult to summarize. It must also be said that the subtitle of the book, A Traditionalist Critique of the Fourth Political Theory, is a very accurate description of a large portion of the book. The bulk of Mr. Upton's work is taken up with a chapter-by-chapter and sometimes line-by-line critique of Dugin's The Fourth Political Theory, published 2012, and The Rise of the Fourth Political Theory, published 2017. These two books are actually a single volume in the original Russian, published in 2009, a fact that is not made obvious to the English-speaking reader. As such, 4 of the 8 chapters of Mr. Upton's book are made up of a close reading and criticism of a single work of Dugin's. This is not to detract from Upton's labour. The Fourth Political Theory is Dugin's signature work, and if only one of his books is to be singled out for the kind of rigorous treatment Upton applies, this is the one. However, Upton's book may have benefited in terms of focus had the preceding and succeeding chapters been excised for publication separately, or else been partly integrated into the central 4 chapters. The earlier chapters are a more general critique of Dugin, while the penultimate chapter offers a highly compelling theory of what Upton calls sacred activism. This is a highly valuable contribution of Upton's, and one I intend to engage with more fully in a forthcoming essay. However, it seems to me to be quite separate from the question of criticizing Dugin. Indeed, the notorious Russian is hardly mentioned in that chapter. And so, I will set it aside in considering Dugin against Dugin. Upton's work should, therefore, most usefully be understood as a traditionalist critique of the book, The Fourth Political Theory, and not Dugin's philosophy generally. This is by no means to suggest Upton would or should be more forgiving of Dugin had he access to the latter's broader oeuvre. Rather, it is to say that Upton's tome is the first and not the last word in perennialist criticism of Dugin. Given that Upton's book is essentially a critical commentary upon Dugin's flagship work, it is hard to concisely summarize Upton's criticisms, so great are they in number. In any case, I can give Dugin against Dugin my wholehearted endorsement, and I encourage all of my readers to acquire a copy. In what follows, I will make an attempt at identifying those of Upton's criticisms of Dugin which, to my mind, are the most central and most universal, as well as offering some of my own commentary upon them. These are, in order of importance: 1. Dugin's Heideggerianism, 2. Dugin's eschatology, and 3. Dugin's misunderstanding of the relationship of Hyperborea and Atlantis. The chief criticism Upton gives of Dugin is that he is, despite Dugin's protestations to the contrary, a postmodernist par excellence. His postmodernism finds its origin in his Heideggerianism. Dugin clearly identifies Heidegger as his chief intellectual influence, and its expression in his relentless self-contradiction. Dugin's Heideggerianism is identified, both by Dugin himself and by Upton, with the Russians' quote, metaphysics of chaos, end quote. Dugin says that what he means by quote-unquote chaos is not mere confusion, but, as Upton observes, Dugin seems utterly confused about what he does mean by quote-unquote chaos. He says he uses chaos in the Greek sense, but also says, following Heidegger, that Greeks had no concept of chaos. This is the first of innumerable self-contradictions in Dugin, a theme to which we will return presently. Dugin writes that by chaos he means not confusion, but pre-manifestation chaos. This is, as Upton says, an unfortunate term for potentiality. What was otherwise termed by Guénon non-being, perhaps Schuon had the best designation for this concept, beyond being. But it is clear by Dugin's explicit identification of chaos with the feminine principle, i.e. the principle of manifestation, that what he really means is post-manifestation chaos. This could be the product of confused thinking, but given Dugin's familiarity with Guénon, as well as the overall greater congruity of this understanding of chaos with the rest of Dugin's thought, as well as his chaotic method, it is more likely outright deception than innocent confusion. Dugin may be also influenced here by Evola in the latter's mistaken ontological prioritization of the manifest over the unmanifest. This notwithstanding, Dugin is a faithful Heideggerian rather than a Guénonian. What Heidegger and Dugin mean by Dasein is the substantial, not essential, end of the substance-essence polarity discussed by Guénon in Reign of Quantity and the Signs of the Times. In other words, the Dasein that Dugin points to as the political subject of his fourth political theory is the phenomenal world and not the noumenal. This is entirely unsurprising in light of Heidegger being the most famous and influential of phenomenologists. Much to Upton's perfectly justified outrage, Dugin proposes humanity quote-unquote postpone God until we have really come to understand Dasein. In the first instance, this is a mad thing to say. The point of departure for anyone claiming to be a traditionalist or a Christian is God. Let us recall the opening words of the Holy Bible. In the beginning, God. But even setting aside the impertinence of proposing the beginning of all things be postponed, postponing knowledge of God until we have come to grips with Dasein amounts to saying that knowledge of God should be delayed indefinitely. Why? Because the phenomenal world is the conditioned world. Being conditioned, it is forever in flux. This is the accidental insight of postmodernists. Without being as the ground of phenomena, what Heidegger calls being with a Y, there is no substance to phenomena. To say the same thing differently, without first securing the solid foundation of being, of the absolute, trying to plumb the depths of Heideggerian being entails throwing oneself down a bottomless well. So, Dugin's call to come to grips with ethnic logoi, which he equates with Dasein, is a recipe for becoming endlessly lost in a postmodern epistemological loop. All this makes Dugin a postmodernist par excellence. It then makes sense that he has a fellowship at Fudan. His ideas are largely in keeping with the postmodern nationalism of CCP ideologues, even if he is more self-consciously postmodern than they are. Before moving on to the next point, let us briefly consider Dugin's method. Here, Upton makes a gripping and astute observation. According to Upton, Dugin makes use of a kind of hypnotic, chaotic method in his writing whereby he employs complex concepts that perpetually contradict each other. This style draws in a reader, allowing the reader to project onto Dugin their own ideological orientation by picking up on those ideas that reflect the reader's own priors, while the contradictions create the impression of sophistication and shield Dugin from criticism. Upton is right in saying that Dugin is archetypally dishonest. The second major issue identified by Upton is, in my analysis, Dugin's heretical eschatology. Dugin asserts that the world will almost end, and thereafter will follow a reversal of time. These claims are totally without scriptural basis and are nonsensical. Time cannot reverse. The cosmic cycle, or Manvantara, must complete itself for the next iteration to come. Summer always returns, but we do not go back to the same summer. Upton identifies in Dugin here the influence of Nietzsche, himself influenced by the Stoics. The significance of this fallacious eschatology, aside from the plain fact of its being in error, is that it recasts decline from a preordained natural and inevitable process to something dependent on human agency. This then serves as a rationale for Dugin's entire project of political activism, and with it opens the door to humanity's demiurgic and ultimately satanic impulses. It is in contrast to this program of time-reversing activism that Upton offers his program of sacred activism. Finally, there is Dugin's misunderstanding of the relationship between Hyperborea and Atlantis. This is important because it is the metaphysical underpinning of Dugin's most important geopolitical framework, the supposed opposition between Atlanticism and Eurasianism, which Dugin equates with the opposition between Hyperborea and Atlantis respectively. In explicating this error, I cannot do better than quote from Upton. Quote, "Properly speaking, Hyperborea and Atlantis are successive phases of the same cycle of manifestation. Alexander Dugin, however, identifies them as the archetype of two contemporary collectives." End quote. This leads Dugin to make certain elementary errors, like ignoring the Viking, that is to say, Atlantean, roots of Russian, or as he would see it, Hyperborean, civilization. As an aside, it is interesting to note that the temporal sequentiality of Hyperborea and Atlantis is something that Evola and esoteric Hitlerists like Sereno get right, where Dugin doesn't, despite the latter's familiarity with the former. Now, Upton does acknowledge there is a degree of legitimacy in Dugin's seeing Hyperborea and Atlantis as two opposed principles, and that this opposition is ongoing. The Hyperborean and Atlantic can legitimately, says Upton, be identified with the essential or masculine pole and the substantial or feminine pole respectively. Dugin is in error in that he posits an absolutized opposition between the two when really they must be harmonized. Dugin proclaims himself to be against the relative, Atlantean-Atlantic, and for the absolute, Hyperborean-Eurasian. This is an error on multiple levels. Firstly, rejecting the relative totally is, as Upton says, trying to create a unity by division. It is a kind of Gnostic error, that's with an uppercase G, It absolutizes the relative by seeing it as something which is not subsumed by the absolute. Secondly, it is unclear how Dugin reconciles this with his embrace of the relative, of Dasein. Either it is a flat contradiction, or else an inversion. Either way, it is an excellent illustration of Dugin's chaotic method discussed in point 1. In Dugin's commitment to chaos, even said commitment is negated. The preceding has been an all too brief synopsis of the essential critiques offered by Upton's book. To repeat, it is essential reading as a devastating opening salvo against Dugin's brand of counter-tradition. It speaks to how powerful Upton's critique is that Dugin and his advocates like Michael Millerman and Arctos Media have completely ignored Upton's charges. Dugin has not replied to Upton's challenge to debate, issued half a decade ago. Dugin, to my knowledge, has only made one dismissive acknowledgement of Upton's book, but no substantive response. The reason for this deafening silence is simple. Dugin et al. Know that Upton has him dead to rights. Compare this to the response Shuonians have given Upton. If you value my work, I'd be most grateful if you would like, subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video with anyone you think might be interested. If you would like to support me in working on this project, I'd be deeply thankful if you would consider becoming a regular supporter through Patreon or making a one-time donation through Ko-fi, links in the description. If you do subscribe, please remember to hit that little bell icon, because otherwise YouTube won't inform you when I upload new videos. If you'd prefer to read my essays over the video format, they are all available in written form on Substack. Link also in the description.